what message would you like to leave with our young CXO Connect audience and some leaders and entrepreneurs who watch us, professionals who are watching this show?
I think at a personal and individual level, especially for young people who are concerned about building skills, I think by far the most important skill is a completely horizontal and completely transferable one. And that is, are you using your time well? Are you being purposeful in how you use your time, right? Or is your time using you?
To use a non-controversial Indian example, what would be the closest thing where you think that think tanks can do better?
Some think tanks, I'm afraid, have not been as humble, have not been as engaged in this process of building trust as they need to be.
Welcome to CXO Connect. Today's guest, Rahul Ahluwalia, has journeyed from engineering to an MBA at IIM Calcutta, to economics in Canada, to consulting for Infosys and Deloitte, policy with the Niti Aayog, philanthropy with the Gates and Central Square Foundations, and now nation building as the founding director for the Foundation for Economic Development. Rahul, it's a pleasure to have you with us. That's quite a mouthful of an introduction. Let me start off by sort of asking you about your early childhood and journey. You started your journey, let's say, at DPS Puram, and then you went on to study mechanical engineering at the Visvesvaraya Institute of Technology. When you look back, what were the early interests during your school and college years, and how have they sort of shaped your subsequent years?
Thank you for having me, Prasad, first of all. Real pleasure to be here with you. I think if I go even slightly earlier back, right, I think my father was an NTPC. He used to get transferred around a lot. So in 9th grade, when I joined DPS Puram, that was my 9th school. I lived across the country, studied across the country, in small towns, big cities, everywhere. And I grew up with this enduring fascination for the country, for how it changed and transformed, as we were talking earlier, because of 1991. The engineering and MBA decisions for me were honestly not decisions. You are of a similar vintage to me. You know how our decisions got made in those days. Parents said,
good thing to do,
you do it, right? And so I did my engineering. I got into IIM Calcutta. In those days, if you get into IIM Calcutta, you go to
IIM Calcutta.
Right.
Great.
Like,
Yes.
So I did all that. But when I started working, I realized that I wanted to do something else. This experience of growing up and observing firsthand pre-1991 India and post-1991 India, that was very, very influential for me. And like we were discussing, actually, the Times of India had a big role to play in this journey. Swaminathan Iyer had this article called Swanomics. Gurcharan Das had, I think it was a Sunday column.
Yes. There were two columns.
Yeah, exactly. These two columns.
I think Swanomics is still there.
Swanomics is still around. That's right. And both of these columns used to write about the power of these liberalizing reforms. And I could see that power around me in the country, right? And that really influenced me to then further switch into policy and tread off the beaten path of the engineer MBA. And that's when I left my corporate career.
And then in the middle, you sort of went off to the University of British Columbia. You got a master's in economics. When was this sort of placed this in your...
So IIM Calcutta, I think what I was really lucky to experience, which the Indian education system doesn't really allow you, right, typically, is fantastic professors. And I think the econ department in particular was really, really good. And I think they helped me get an initial framework for why the 1991 reforms were so powerful. When I left IIM Calcutta to join my corporate career, I realized that consulting and sort of working for various marketing and sales kinds of roles, they had their own charm. But I realized that they didn't help me think about the world in the same way, with the same kind of frameworks that these professors in IIM Calcutta were helping me do. So I thought, let me try and learn more economics, do more research. So I applied to the Indian School of Business. I took a massive pay cut. So I became a research assistant at ISB with Professor Mudit Kapoor and later Shamika Ravi, who is actually right now in the Prime Minister's Advisory Council. And I was earning 1/3 of what I was in my MBA job, in the research job. But it was very helpful for me because it really helped me understand how research is done, how do people make sense of the world, all of it. And because I wanted to learn more, I wanted to do more, I actually thought I wanted to do a PhD in economics. I'd become a professor myself, but life had other things in store. That's why I went to do a master's in economics in the year 2014, 5 years after my MBA.
What, amongst all your sort of student years, including perhaps your master's, what is your favorite memory, whether it's from your engineering college or from school, the nine schools that you've been to? What's your sort of favorite memory from your student years?
Each one has different, and I think for me, the defining moments have actually been sort of these not positive memories, but negative memories, right? And it's that's what's springing to mind immediately. So I'll stick with those.
That's fine.
Right. So I think when I was very young, in second grade, I was in this tiny school in Bihar, and they asked me to, because I was a bright kid, they asked me to stand up and give the valedictory speech or whatever it is. And I froze with stage fright, and I wasn't able to say a thing. And that sort of dogged me for a very long time. But over time, I learned how to overcome that kind of fear of public speaking, being up on stage. And today, when I look back, it sort of strikes me that, starting off and not being able to do something is no reason to limit yourself. Today, I feel comfortable on a stage. We've had that discussion in Lucknow that we are also there for. I feel comfortable in front of cameras. And it's very different from what I was like in school. Similarly, in high school, I was terrible at applying myself. We discussed about how when we're young, we do kachra with our lives, right? And I was a grade A kachra doer in my life. I used to fail subjects regularly. I used to bunk classes. I used to lie to my parents. And when all of that came out, right, that I'm doing all this, my parents treated me with love, with affection, and they asked me, what can we do to help you get out of that? And that sort of snapped me into a different reality, right? I was like, what am I doing with myself, right? So the value of second chances, the value of really being a person with integrity, being a person who approaches life in a different kind of way came home to me. So college was all great from an academic perspective. It was fantastic to party. It was fantastic to make friends, many of whom I still have till today. And in all of these respects, it was wonderful. But I think really foundational events happened to me through early school. Yeah.
What was your first job? And is there something that you learned which still stays with you when you are conducting sort of your own operations?
My very first job was at Infosys, right out of engineering. Right? So there were a couple of things I learned there. I think one, which was coding, which was very helpful for a large part of my life, but today it's very rare for me to use it. The other, I think, which was very interesting, is that Infosys had a certain value system back then, right? So just professionalism, being humble, focusing on the customer, focusing on delighting the customer. And I don't have a customer per se these days, but still, whoever is at the other end of my work, keeping the focus on them and what they need is something that still stays with me. Very important. Out of B school, my first job was at HCL Technologies, where I was doing marketing. And I think I learned there that marketing is very critical. You can have a good product, but until and unless you market it well, there's no point. Nobody's going to know about it. Nobody's going to buy it. Nobody's going to try it. You may as well not have a product.
So from Infosys to HCL to now, your own foundation for economic development. If someone asked you today, what do you do? How would you sort of introduce yourself in one line?
That's a tough question. Because what we do is slightly difficult. But the closest I have is that we try and make it easier to do business in India so that people can invest and grow and create jobs and create livelihoods for other people, right? So we try and work with government to reduce regulations, to improve ease of doing business, to make India a more competitive place on the global stage. So that's what our foundation does. I don't know if that leaves you more or less confused than when you asked the question.
When you're working in the policy sector, standard question आप क्या करते हैं? क्या करते हैं? मैं सरकार के साथ काम करता हूँ. सरकार के साथ आप क्या? So it can go on for a bit, right? And that's why I was trying to say, is there a one-liner where you can describe what you're doing?
Sometimes I tell people I work with an NGO, and then we have a completely different idea of what we do. Which in some ways
is true.
In some ways is true.
Looking back, and you worked through Infosys and HCL, you worked in Deloitte in consulting, you worked on policy with the Niti Aayog, you've done some research for ISB and Brookings,
Yes.
You've worked with the Gates Foundation, Central Square Foundation, which are philanthropic social sector endeavors.
Yes.
And now you're building an institution. Looking back, what are the connecting dots for you? And is there a common thread that you're carrying across all these sectors?
The common thread has always been for me understanding what drives public policy and governance and what can improvements in governance and public policy do to improve the lives of people. Right? So consistently, through my research, through my work at various think tanks, through my work with Niti Aayog, through my work with the Gates Foundation, the consistent thread has always been, how can I understand the role of government in improving people's lives? And how can I help improve what government does and how it does it to help improve the lives of people? The poverty rate in India in 1991 was around 45%. So extreme poverty in India was around 45%. And if we go all the way back to 1947, the poverty rate in India was around 50 to 55% at most, right? So in so many years, poverty barely reduced at all. It reduced a little bit in the 80s, but barely. In just 20 years of liberalization, 1991 to 2011, poverty dropped to 20%, 25 percentage point reduction, right? In a country of 1 billion people,
that's a huge number.
That's huge number.
That's a huge number.
It's 250 million people who are
pulled up above the poverty.
Pulled up. I saw this happening in my life. We discussed it earlier. And I think the starkest example to me always, which might be more familiar to anyone, is the lives of the poor people that you interact with. For a typical middle class person, that's your domestic help, right? Now, you and me, we remember when we were young kids, I don't think we had air conditioning in our houses.
But
right? I didn't have air conditioning in my house. There was no such thing as a washing machine in my house, right? We had a cooler for which electricity would go, water would go, all of that, right? Our fridge was maybe 25 years old or something like that.
Typically, you live with your televisions and refrigerators for much longer.
Much longer, right? 25 years old. And the ladies who used to come work at our house used to live terrible lives, right? They would live in a slum. They would be scraping together enough money to feed their kids barely. Today, the lady who works at my house, at her home, she has an air conditioner, she has a washing machine, her kid has a bike, her kid has gone to college, right? So even if we forget the statistics, even if we look at the lived experiences of people, we can clearly see that this growth has made a huge difference to the regular lives of Indians across all strata of society. It doesn't mean we're in a perfect place, right? There are many Indians who are still living very difficult lives today, But I think this tells us the process by which Indians' lives improve, right? And that process is better public policy, more economic growth, more jobs. 3-4 years ago, when I looked around me, I did not see enough people giving enough importance to this process in the not-for-profit space. So government, of course, is very keen to increase jobs, is very keen to drive investment. But in the not-for-profit space, there was no one directly working in this. That's when we started up the Foundation for Economic Development.
On that sort of segue, what role do you think tanks and independent institutions as yours, what role do you think they play in shaping government decision and policy? Where have you seen some of these institutions that you may have worked at or just, observed in your domain of work? Where have you seen some of them succeed with positively influencing policy? And maybe some instances of where they've really struggled and what they could have done better.
So look, I think first of all, I want to start with the disclaimer that ultimately the decisions being made are always by the political and bureaucratic representatives of the country, right? I think there was a time, and there have been times when non-elected actors have had more prominence. But I don't think today that is the case. I don't think today the majority role being played is by non-governmental actors. I think the government is very proactive, and the decisions being made are definitely by government. I think where not-for-profits and non-governmental organizations have a role to play is clearly chalking out the research, clearly outlining the work that government does, and supporting them in detailing and laying out the aspects that they may not have the time to go over. And I'll give you examples. Right? I think typically a political leader or bureaucrat's time in India, especially the good political leaders and the good bureaucratic officers, goes in firefighting. Right? Their capacity is so constrained that they are consistently finding that they either have to respond to a court summons, major
some here and now issue,
right? So the immediate plus important plus urgent bucket is always occupying their entire day. I think where we come in is in this bucket of important but not urgent reforms, right? And important but not urgent reforms that the government recognizes must be done, but they don't have the time and capacity to take up. So what we do is we help them do some detailing around those, right? Let's take some changes that have happened in Uttar Pradesh recently, which is a state that we work with. Uttar Pradesh has liberalized a lot of building bylaws, right?
Yeah.
Like just a few months ago. And this is very much something that has happened on the directives of the political and bureaucratic leadership. But I think we and organizations like ourselves, I'm not here to take credit for work, right? But people like us and other organizations, consulting firms, people like us, have helped in saying, okay, if we want to liberalize building bylaws, what are the building bylaws in other states? What are the building bylaws in other countries, right? What are the
best practices?
What are the best practices, right? अगर आपको FSI बढ़ाना है, तो which state in India has increased FSI, right? Which other countries have increased FSI? So we help them with research like this, and ultimately the call is taken by the political and bureaucratic leadership.
Where do you think you struggle? I mean,
yeah,
organizations, not particularly your institution, but organizations.
I think so. One issue always is economic policy and public policy, because it's such a public and powerful instrument, right? There are lots and lots of vested interests and lots of people who stand to gain from certain public policy moves being made versus some others, right? And in public policy, there is a very classic term called concentrated costs and diffuse benefits, right? just to illustrate what that means, right? And I'll take the example of a different country than ours so that we don't run into any pointless controversy. So let's say in the US, right, car dealerships have come up across the country. Car dealerships become relatively powerful and they make it passed into law that if a car company has to sell cars directly to consumers, they cannot do so. They must do so by going through a dealership. Right? And what they'll say is this is for the benefit of the consumer. They'll have a local dealership around. They can do servicing, blah, blah, blah. There are all kinds of justifications. But ultimately what they are doing is they are using the law to increase their own profit margins. Right? True. And ultimately it needs someone like a Tesla to come in and try and disrupt this model and push states to say, why do we need it? Right? So because this is so dangerous to car dealerships, this cost is concentrated to them of a disruptor. They will fight back very viciously because it hurts them directly. The benefits are distributed across millions of car buyers. Right? For each car buyer, the benefit is small. Your car will be $100 cheaper if you don't go through a dealership.
But at an aggregate level,
it is huge benefit. Right? So this kind of formulation leads to a lot of vested interests. So the dealership is a vested interest. Right? Similarly, you can say in the US again, you need licensing for many professions. Right? If you have to, you need a license to become a barber in many states in the US.
Sure.
Right? So now every barber who has gotten a license loves the license because more barbers cannot get a license easily.
It's a moat around business.
It's a moat around your business. So entry barriers have been set up. So barbers can charge more money because there's less competition. For each customer, your haircut is $1 more expensive. You're going to be like, chalo, in aggregate, it hurts us all. But so you're not really going to fight for this. Correct. You're not going to fight for this. But the barbers are going to fight against this. This is the problem that you face in India as well, right? And everywhere. It's not just India. It's not limited to us.
So you said you don't want pointless controversy. You can get into pointed controversy if you want.
Yeah, sure.
To use a non-controversial Indian example, what would be the closest thing where you think that think tanks and institutions working on shaping policy can do better? I mean, let's not say they've failed, but
absolutely,
let's say can do better and find better ways of being more impactful in their shaping of government policy.
Sure. The primary question here is of trust, right? Because you're dealing with public policy, how do people trust that you're doing it with the right intentions, that you're doing it for the right purposes? Right. That's very difficult to do. And I think generating and engendering that trust has been difficult for a lot of Indian think tanks. And that's primarily because the think tanks have also become very politicized and very ideological.
Okay.
Right? I think we have to focus on what actually works in improving people's lives and not what is our ideological position in improving people's lives. So I think being more driven by data, driven by evidence, being more open to disagreement, and putting forward our thoughts and our views respectfully with humility, with the backing of the appropriate evidence is the most important thing.
A couple of think tanks you think are doing great work, you sort of idolize or you think can serve as a role model to others in that space?
I don't know if I want to name names here, but I think there are several academics and several think tanks who have done a good job. And again, I think the important thing to look for is how driven by data and how driven by evidence people are, as opposed to how driven by debate and ideology. I don't want to the memes.
You've been working with bureaucrats for a very long time.
Yeah, I have, and I need to
And you
continue.
pick up-
I need to continue working
And
with
you
them.
pick up those traits.
I need to continue
Nothing
working
wrong about
with them.
Let's get to your organization, the Foundation for Economic Development.
Yeah.
As the founding direction, what is your mission, your vision, your template in a couple of lines? Like what's similar question to आप क्या करते हैं, but
I think
आपका organization क्या करता है?
the mission and vision is very clear. We want to improve the average Indian standard of living to developed country levels as fast as possible. We want to try and make it so that the average Indian's life is no different from the average European's or the average American's life. When you start with this vision and you start with this mission, the immediate question and the immediate point becomes, okay, how does this happen? Right? And the very simple answer, so simple that it almost feels silly, is that you have to increase the rate of economic growth. And I think we forget how powerful compounding is, right? So let me just give you a simple example that we use sometimes. If we grow for the next 30 years
Okay.
at 4% per annum,
Okay.
our per capita income or our per capita standard of living on average will reach where Libya is today, right? In 30 years. If we grow at 6%, just for 2 percentage points for 30 years, we will reach where Mexico is today. Still not great, right? Neither Libya nor Mexico sound like fantastic places.
I mean, those are population samples of maybe, I don't know, 20 million, 25 million.
Yeah,
You're
fair.
a billion plus people.
Fair, right? But if we grow at 8% a year,
Okay.
we will reach in 30 years where Greece is today. Greece already sounds nice. If we grow at 10% per year, we will reach the European Union standard of living, right? So we think of these...
So 4 to 10 means you move from Libya
to
EU.
you, right?
Wonderful.
And Europe is approximately as developed as you get.
See, you made a very interesting point. I've seen that you've spoken about India needing broad-based and sustained growth of 10% plus, right? And that's been your sort of go-to mantra.
Exactly.
Which sectors are the biggest levers for growth in the next, not 30 years, but let's say in the next decade and a half? Which sectors do you think are the biggest levers which will get India to grow at 10+%?
So I'll answer this in a slightly different way. I will get to the sectors point. I know in today's environment, it sounds a little ironic to say this, but I think the most important thing to focus on is export.
Okay.
Right? And the reason for that is that no country has ever grown fast without focusing on export. You start with Japan, grew fast because of export. Taiwan, export. South Korea, export. You can talk about Singapore, Hong Kong if you want, but also export. They're tiny. China, only and only export has taken it to where it is today. And one country we forget in this long list of export-driven economies is India.
But countries like Singapore and Hong Kong have a model where you're not actually exporting anything. You're basically sort of, you're like a free port, you're a services trading hub. I mean, that's the model.
That's what they went to. But originally when Singapore started up, they started up with factories of garments and factories of toy making and factories of electronics.
But your prosperity is bound to your free port, and you're sort of sitting in a very strategic location on the edge of the Strait of Malacca, whatever.
True enough.
That's sort of...
True enough. But those areas became strategic because of export and trade.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they would not be.
So your main point is to focus on export.
Focus on export. And let me give you a little bit of more color to that, right? And this point that you made is actually fantastic because it helps you understand. So export will over time depend on what you are good at in that moment, right? So when Singapore got started as a country, and this is the point I was coming to, when Singapore got started as a country, they were not depending on just the port, and they were not depending on this free port access through that area. They set up a lot of labor-intensive manufacturing for export across a whole bunch of different industries, and that allowed them to set up a port, invest in it substantially, and it kind of co-developed, right? The same is the story of Japan and South Korea, which are bigger countries.
What about a place like Dubai?
So Dubai actually is also a
Purely
fantastic
trading hub.
purely trading hub, right? But they set
And
up
tax-free trading hub.
tax-free trading hub, right? So they're taking advantage of what they have and using that to facilitate trade. And
so export does a lever to facilitate trade.
Exactly.
And therefore sort of roll money.
Exactly. And here's the intuition for it, right? And we don't understand the intuition. And what I love about economics is that it helps you develop intuitions. The intuition is this. If we went to a village in the interior of Maharashtra, right? And our assignment was, tomorrow, how can this village earn much more with the same products, the same skills, the same people that it has today? What would we tell this village? Right? And when I put it like this, the answer to many people is quite evident. Is you would say, if you were making pots or if you're making...
Sell it outside the village.
Sell it to Mumbai.
Sell it to Mumbai. Yeah.
Right?
Move to a bigger city.
Sell your products in a big city. Right? For India, the big city is the West. Right? This is why every exporter has higher profit realizations. The markets are bigger. Right?
But look, there are certain sectors in export, and I see this with some very intimate understanding of a lot of these sectors, where if you go back maybe a decade or so, Indians were selling goods almost at a break-even model.
Right.
And all that the exporters sort of looked forward to were two things. One was something which was a duty drawback, which was sometimes as high as a good double-digit 80-90% in many cases, but in most cases it's 8 to 10%. And what you also did was that exporters were always a cash positive, in a cash positive situation, because you discounted your letter of credit. And that was how exports worked. What's changed? Because are exporters sort of making better margins? Are they making money? How do you think exports, if the mindset hasn't changed, then how do you think exports will drive foundational economic growth?
So, super interesting points, right? I think one is what is the potential difference? So correct. And one, what is the actual story on the ground?
Correct. Right? Both. How do you see that difference? Because with exporters, I've seen that they're cash positive. There's a 10% duty drawback. That becomes your margin, effective margin. And you're running a 10% margin business. But that is a very self-limiting, very sustainable but non-scalable model.
Absolutely, 100%. And that actually speaks to what are we doing here, right? Because if businesses were able to be competitive in the global market, we could just stay home and
do something else.
Right? So I think, so to finish the point on the potential, the market outside is huge, right? So let's take the example of, and we can stick with the example of the apparel sector, right?
Correct.
Garment making. So the Indian garment market, right? There's a BCG study from 2019 which estimates our market at approximately $55 billion. Right? The global market is around $500 billion. Right? So
55 million to 500.
55 billion.
Billion. To 500.
To 500 billion. Right?
So we are about 10%.
We are about 10% as a market. Right? Of that 500 billion, 150 billion is China. Right? They export 150 billion. So this 500 billion is mainly imports by the West. So America, all of
China is 30%.
China is 30% of all exports.
All exports. Right? All global apparel exports.
Exactly. So if we could just take and we are around 16 to 17 billion dollars, right? So we are 10% of what China is doing, right?
Correct.
Our market will grow only
So 55 will become whatever, 60.
5-6% पे ही grow कर सकते हैं. If you fundamentally improve the competitiveness of our apparel sector relative to China's, we can grow at 15, 20, 25%.
So if you just take
If you take half of China's market, our market
that's 70,
doubles.
that's 75.
That's 75
I mean,
billion.
of course, our market doubles.
Our market doubles. And here's the interesting part. China's share has been dropping since 2014. In 2014, they actually had $185 billion. Right? They had 37% of the world market. Since then, year on year, their share has been dropping.
And our share has been going up.
Our share has been absolutely stagnant.
Okay. Who's going up?
Who's going up? Bangladesh is going up.
Mm-hmm.
Vietnam is going up. So in 2014, Bangladesh's exports were almost the same as ours, $17 to $18 billion. Today, they are $47 billion. Vietnam, again, almost the same as ours. Today, they are $42 billion. Right?
So they have trebled from where they are,
Yeah.
almost
Yes,
tripled.
almost.
And we are sort of stagnated.
Yes.
So there's an opportunity.
And the answer lies in what you very rightly raised. Our guys are not competitive, right? They have to depend on the duty drawback. They have to depend on all of these government schemes, SOPs, right? They are not fundamentally competitive. And when you approach, why are they not fundamentally competitive? And we did some work on this.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is, for a garment, there are actually mainly just two things that go into a garment. Once I say it, it won't be pretty obvious. 50% of the garment's cost is raw material. 25% of the garment's cost is labor that goes into stitching it. 75% of each shirt or pant or whatever is a combination of these two factors of production. The rest is some logistics, some cost of capital, some cost of utilities, etc. But relatively smaller.
This is
the bulk.
This is the bulk.
Right? Raw material in India is anywhere between 10 to 35% more expensive than raw materials elsewhere. Labor in India is more expensive than labor in Bangladesh.
But sure, I mean, you're not comparing sweatshops to slightly more organized as a sector business.
I mean, you can call them sweatshops, but today's Bangladeshi worker is better off than the average Indian worker, right?
How about
female labor force participation in Bangladesh
is much more. Oh, yes.
Because they have exactly these quote-unquote sweatshops to work in. These women are choosing to work in these sweatshops, right? These sweatshops.
It's an economic opportunity for them.
It's an economic opportunity
and
for them.
For women, it's,
exactly.
it's a very different social construct.
Exactly. Right? So instead of having to work in a field or having to work...
Women in the workforce. How about Vietnam? You were saying Vietnam is the...
So Vietnam is approximately the same cost
as India in terms of labor.
In terms of labor, but their productivity is much higher. Right? Okay. And so when you dig a little deeper into both of these, you find that regulation is to blame for both.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So on the raw material side, we have had for the longest time protection for raw material being manufactured in India.
You were not competitive and therefore you wanted to first set up your industries.
Exactly right.
Which is fine.
So now when you protect the upstream industry, the downstream industry suffers.
Yes.
Right?
Well, it's a tough act, right? I mean, you've got to protect. What do you not protect and what do you sort of let go of?
It's a very tough act.
Right? Where do you sort of find value?
Very tough act, right? And this again goes back to this sort of concentrated cost and diffuse benefit. Upstream, we have large players that exist and their legitimate interests are threatened if you say you open up the market. Your profit margins are going to drop. Sometimes you may be driven out of business. So they want to protect their business. In several sectors, we want to protect some of them, right? So some strategic sectors are there. We may say steel, we may say semiconductors. I think the question is, how do you balance protection with damage to downstream sectors? Often what happens is downstream sectors are huge in comparison, right? So X amount of raw material can go into 100x amount of shirts, right? So apparel stitching creates so many more jobs, right? If you have a big factory making fiber,
you need machines, you need maintenance of machines.
Exactly,
it creates a lot of ancillary jobs.
Exactly right.
Right.
At most. the garment factory will directly create lakhs of jobs, right?
Sure.
So for every $1 billion of output, you create 1 lakh jobs. Whereas on the fiber and fabric side, for every $1 billion of output, you may be creating somewhere between 10,000 to 5,000 to 10,000 jobs, right? So these are balancing acts that are very difficult for us to play, right? And we have to try and see how do we prevent damage to upstream industries, but not throw the baby out with the bathwater and not have competitiveness in downstream industry.
Can I sort of come back to the second part of my original question, which was which sectors are the biggest levers for growth in the next decade?
Sure. So I think in sector after sector, what we should do is try and find where is our competitiveness, right? And so there is a difference between what is our potential competitiveness if we deregulate and make it easy to do business versus what is our actual competitiveness today. If we look at potential for where we can grow, all of these labor-intensive sectors where China is vacating space is a huge opportunity for us if we
because of demographics pure.
Because of demographics purely. Right? So, and it suits our needs as well, right? We need to create jobs. We need to get people off the farm away. Yes. Right? So it suits our needs. We should try and make ourselves more competitive in electronics assembly, in garments, in furniture, in footwear, right? In toys manufacturing.
All the places that China dominates, we can sort of
dominated in the past.
Yeah, we can
completely step up, and we should
step up, and
we should
have a better market share.
100%. Like today, we have 1.8% of.
So mostly manufacturing,
but again, it needs us to get our house in order. Right? It will not come to us naturally. If we keep that aside, I think growth sectors that today are seeing a lot of investment, domestic sectors, services sectors, these remain important and we should continue to focus on them. We should ensure that they don't drop behind. But this is where I see the big potential. I think tourism is another massive potential sector. So we need to get our house in order.
Where do you see our policy priorities shifting in the next decade or so? There's a lot of talk on public policy on health. Education seems to tickle a lot of our imagination all the time. There's, of course, green growth, or we're talking about digital transformation. But interestingly and anecdotally purely, and I don't have exact figures with me, but I think the fertilizer subsidy in India is perhaps more than we spend on public health. Now, how do you think that you can reconcile some of these priorities in the right order,
right,
so that there is better foundational investment in economic development?
Yeah. I think the foundations of economic growth and economic development are good institutions of law and order, economic freedom, contract enforcement, right? So well-functioning courts, relatively less interference in people's economic activity, relatively low taxes. And these...
Do you think we have relatively high taxes?
We have relatively high taxes.
So what does a relatively low tax model look like?
A relatively low tax model, first and foremost, looks like it being not concentrated so much on the formal sector. I think we have very few direct taxpayers in the country.
Right.
And as a result, both the rates and the enforcement of tax in our country is, how should I say it? It results in needless tax disputes. It results in, so for instance, there are 13.5 lakh crores of tax demands that are in dispute, right? And this is a massive number, right? And the interesting thing is, almost all of these appeals will eventually be lost, right? So courts turn down, and again, I don't have the exact number, but I think the number is approximately 70 to 75% of tax demands that are in dispute ultimately the tax man loses, right? So all of these assets, people have to either deposit some advance with the tax guy, they have to keep constantly fighting in court.
Typically, if you're taking into court, of course, you have to pay up, I think, about half the money up front and then keep arbitrating on it.
Exactly right. So it's not just the rate, which also in India is higher.
What is a good tax rate?
Again, this depends on what you need to fund.
Let's say you were the finance minister for the day. What would you do with our tax structure?
I think the most important thing, again, one is you should typically not be taxing income, you should be taxing consumption. Right?
Okay.
So we should move purely to a GST style or a property tax style regime instead of having direct income, because then what economists typically say is that you are distorting people's usage of money unfairly. So that income that you have, you will reinvest, right, somewhere, unless you consume it. When you consume it, you should be taxed. When you invest it, you should not be taxed because
it's money in the economy.
Money in the economy, right?
Money with the banks.
Money with the banks. It's helping people create more, right? It's helping people expand the pie, right? So that there is no, I don't think there is one correct tax rate. I think, right? As a benchmark against our other economies, so Vietnam, for instance, China, for instance, our tax rate is substantially higher. So Vietnam is anywhere between 10 to 15% corporate tax. China is anywhere 15-20% corporate tax, and we are 25%. Right? But again, it's not just the rate. Like they say in India, sometimes the process is the punishment, right? So the tax process has to be a lot smoother. There has to be a lot more tax certainty. There have to be a lot fewer tax disputes. Right? So that's a very important part of what we need to fix on the tax system. Going back to what you started with, right? Like, where should you invest?
Where should you invest?
And I think where you should invest is on these foundations first and foremost. We need much better courts, right? We need much more economic freedom for people to be able to import, export, manufacture, right? Ease of doing business in India today is not at all where we want it to be, right? And I think the government recognizes this. The government has set up several commissions and committees to look at this and try and drive this work forward. So that, I think, is key. That's the foundation. Then we come to the topics that you mentioned: public health, public education. Again, I think very, very important. But I think they sit above this pyramid of basic state capacity. If you don't have basic state capacity of law and order, you don't have basic state capacity of courts, right? It's very difficult to get these more difficult services to function well, right? Providing education and high quality education is a very complex activity, right? We think of it as a very simple activity, but just imagine, every state government has a lakh and a half teachers. Every single one of these teachers is in a small rural area where they are perhaps the only teacher. At most, there is one other teacher with them in a school. How are you supposed to monitor and regulate these people and ensure that they are providing an appropriate education to our children? Because you're trying to manage them from the state level is very, very difficult. Right? We have a very centralized system of government.
On the flip side, if you're not investing enough in things like public health,
right,
education, infrastructure, then critically things like export won't work, because you will have a populace which is not particularly skilled, not particularly healthy, and without infrastructure, with no way to get to anywhere. Right?
So I'm not arguing that we shouldn't invest. I'm arguing that we should invest effectively. Today we are investing, right? And most measures of our investment are actually approximately at par with what most other countries invest.
Correct.
The problem is we don't have people who are educated, we don't have people who are healthy, in spite of our education, in spite of our investments. Because our current mode of investments is very leaky, right? We pay our teachers, public school teachers, enormous amounts of money relative to our GDP per capita, right? So, and what do we get for it in return, right? If you look at any ASAR report, our children don't learn anything in school. And on a per capita basis, the government spends anywhere between 40 to 80,000 rupees per child per year, right? So it's not that we are not spending, it's that we are not getting any return for our spending, right? And a big reason for the fact that we are not getting any return on spending is there is no accountability. Our courts don't function, our police doesn't function, we don't have local government bodies that function well. So the same things that are needed for economic activity to take place are the same things that are needed for development to take place on education and healthcare.
Okay. If you had to pick up one reform that could really be a game changer and accelerate India's growth story, what would it be?
Oh, massive question.
And the first thing to invest in.
So I think I'll start with what is the easiest thing to reform, right? And that is also very impactful. And I think several states have started doing this now. And that is building regulations and building bylaws, right? Okay. So I think there is no vested interest against improving building density in India, right? I think we just have slightly outmoded notions that you should not build dense cities. Whereas actually dense cities are, on a per capita basis, very, very effective ways of providing high standards of living to people, right? So to provide a high standard of living to the same person in a village or in a spread out city is very expensive, but in a dense city, it's much more cheap, right? And you just economies of scale. Right?
It's economies of scale.
Economies of scale. You set up one good school, you can service many more people. Yeah. Set up one good hospital, you can service many more
people. Right. If you typically are in densely packed apartment blocks, a school is still servicing a radius of maybe 3 kilometers.
Exactly right.
But just many more people in their catchment area.
Exactly right. Sewage treatment plants.
Correct. That's unit economics. That's one
unit economics. Yeah, no one. Exactly. So, but somehow because we approached it from a old style Soviet leftist kind of architectural worldview, not even an economic worldview, right? Le Corbusier was one of our heroes. Chandigarh was the best planned city according to us. We have militated against dense cities, right? And I think we should move towards more dense cities, right? And that I think is more and more becoming an idea that is what
are you working with bureaucrats and you're advocating that they move to apartments? Is that going to happen?
Actually, today, bureaucrats have moved to apartments. Yes. So they have moved to apartments.
Yeah, but
they used to.
Your question of your idea of a space, bungalow with a lot of space and land, still exists, it's right? True. And most of those things are occupied even in our city by bureaucrats.
I agree, but if you look at just one level lower, tall apartments.
Correct, because they can't they can't increase the number of bungalows.
Exactly right. So they themselves have moved away, right? And of course, so I think this one reform is A, allow more dense cities, and B, shift to a governance model that allows more local decisions to be taken. China is a very centralized country and India is a very decentralized country. At the local level in India, it is impossible for almost anybody to make any meaningful decisions. Any city that you live in, almost all except Delhi, because Delhi is a slightly unique case, any city that you live in is run from the state government, right? The state government has 100 cities to look after. How well will they look after each city? When you're responsible for everything, you're not responsible for anything, right? So running our cities better is the biggest reform. And I think we have to find a new model in which to do it. We have to allow each state flexibility to change many more laws, many more rules for at least some cities, right? My proposal, which I have written about, is that allow every state to take 5% of its land area and denote that a special zone. We call it a nodal investment zone. In that zone, give the state government all powers of, you can change labor laws, you can change the building laws, you can change land laws in that one area. Right? Just this one area allows us to experiment with policy. It allows us to change policy quickly. So I'll give you an example of how powerful this can be. China started this one zone called Shenzhen, right, in the late 1980s. Today, just that Shenzhen region is 300 square kilometers or so, right? 300 square kilometers is smaller than the size of Delhi by a lot. Right? Just that one area exports $300 billion from it. All of India's exports are $420 odd billion. So that one city size area can become an enormous engine for growth. So focusing on how do we enable city size areas to be these labs where we can experiment with our policy structure, where each chief minister has a lot more latitude. We are not trying to run the city area from either Delhi or from the state capital, right? Let that region experiment, let it find the sector that it is most sort of fertile for, and let these guys grow. And there is no downside, because if they get something wrong, it's a tiny area in a state, right? The upside is massive. Even one small area that gets it right, it can rival Gurgaon, it can rival Bangalore.
You want to rival Gurgaon and Bangalore with their traffic issues?
Traffic issues is only one side.
Infrastructure issues?
Infrastructure issues only one side of it. Imagine the value that these places have created.
Yeah, sure.
Bangalore is 70 to 80% of Karnataka's budget. Hyderabad is 70 to 80% of now Telangana's budget. Earlier it was United Andhra Pradesh budget. This resource generation, I agree.
But that's true of most state capitals.
Exactly right. So these come with their downsides. I agree with you. There is congestion, all of these things. But we can't lose sight of the positives. Right? They fund the entire welfare expenditure of the state. They fund the entire infrastructure expenditure of the state. So many positives come along with that. So absolutely we should try and rival them. Maybe we should be a little bit more careful in trying to...
in urban planning.
Problems, absolutely.
Let's sort of change track. This is a section that is sort of ubiquitously called a rapid fire round. It is... We want you to say the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
You needn't be extremely rapid. There's no firing involved. Just your top of the mind answers, okay? One urgent reform India needs today.
Decentralisation.
A book or thinker who has shaped your worldview.
Lant Bridget.
Okay. One skill every professional in the policy space should have.
I think fundamental knowledge of economics is very important. And the second is persuasion. I think without persuading people, you can get nowhere.
Philanthropy in one word. Catalyst or supplement?
I think supplement. Yeah.
A government reformer that you admire the most?
Oh, there are so many.
Name a few.
But I think the most important are that 1991 crew. I think A.N. Verma, who was Secretary Industries and then later Principal Secretary to Narasimha Rao. Narasimha Rao himself, for what he did at that time. Manmohan Singh, Rahul Ahluwalia. All of these people changed the trajectory of the nation. I think later they were followed by Vajpayee and Prime Minister Vajpayee's group of ministers that again did a lot to reform. But I think what they have accomplished for the country is astounding to me.
Coffee chats with policymakers or detailed research papers, what moves the needle more?
What moves the needle more is definitely chats with policymakers. You can write research papers all you like, but it's ultimately relationships and persuasion that makes the difference.
Brilliant. And your definition of true impact?
Seeing the lives of the poorest and the most vulnerable improve, right? So I keep going back to, there was a time when I went to just get a chai at a little local sort of kholi, and that chai wala's daughter, she couldn't have been more than 3 or 4, She handed me this cup of chai, and till today that image haunts me, stays with me. I'm like, how can this girl's life be such that she doesn't have to be selling chai at this little completely informal cart on the roadside, right? So that's my image. That's the image that stays with me. Her life becoming better is true impact for me.
Having worked across corporates, government, non-profits, some cultural differences that stand out, and some leadership lessons that have traveled well and served you well across these worlds that you've spanned.
I'll start with the latter. I think being genuine is the only thing I have found does anything useful for me. I have never learned to be a different way with sort of different groups of people. And I think being genuine, I think, has helped me a lot, right? It helps me connect with people. It helps people understand that I don't mean badly, even when I behave in ways that
Even when you behave badly.
I mean, what they may think is bad behavior. So I'm just arguing for what I think is right and what I'm passionate about. So that's something that has sort of traveled with me throughout, and trying to be humble along with it. I had nothing to not be humble about in any case. So that's been super helpful. Cultural differences, I think, are enormous, right? And I think they matter so much. And you can see the cultural shift in corporate India. There was a time when India was home to the Lala company, right? Lalaji walks in, the big man of the office. Everyone has to stand up and pay respect. And I think you can see that in corporate India, that's no longer true, right? There is obviously some respect to your boss, but that respect is not sycophancy usually, right? It's that you have to have some kind of hierarchy, but people are on first name basis. They can joke with their boss, right? You can, and the really important thing about this is that if your boss has a bad idea, you can call it out. In total, that culture means that fewer bad ideas will make it past, right? Bad ideas will still make it past, but there'll be fewer. I think government has not made that transition yet. Right? I think government there is a lot of Ji Hazuri. So whether it is the bureaucrat to their political master or the junior bureaucrat to the senior bureaucrat. So it is expected that whatever the senior is saying must be right. To speak up against it is very difficult. It's not impossible by any stretch of the imagination. Lots of great bureaucrats I have seen stand up to their political bosses and to their bureaucratic bosses, but it's a lot more difficult. And I think that this transition is happening. If we see this cultural transition happen more and more in government, it'll be good for us.
You were talking about bureaucracy. How do you stay resilient when progress is slow, as it often is, or when, let's say, bureaucratic processes or politicians and politics is creating bottlenecks? How do you sort of stay with it, push through that?
I think this is true in any part of life, is that the karam is what matters and not the phal, right? So focus on your karam and do not focus on the phal. And that's the only thing that keeps you going, is the only thing that keeps you inspired. You are here to do your bit for the world and for yourself. Whether it translates into success or failure is not up to us.
On that note, Rahul, thank you so much for joining us today on CXO Connect. We wish you and the Foundation for Economic Development the very best. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. It's really been wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful for me.